Hey, my name's Brent. Welcome back to 49cc Scoop. So in one of my videos about the SSR Lazer 5 moped, someone asked me if I could show them step by step how to replace the stator. Now I don't have my original engine in the moped anymore, but it's sitting right up here on the workbench, so I thought I'd go ahead and show you how to remove the stator just like he asked. And I've also got a Piranha 160cc pit bike engine in that moped now, and both of the engines use a little bit different stator setup. They're a little bit different to replace. So I thought I'd go ahead and show you how to replace the stator on either one of those, and that covers the most common styles of stator on these pit bike, moped, etc. engines. Let's get started with the original engine out of the SSR moped. So the first thing you're going to want to do is find this wire coming out of this cover here on the engine. You'll see a group of wires, and you'll want to follow that up until you find a connector, and once you find the connector, go ahead and disconnect that. Next, you'll need to remove the side cover that is over the stator and the flywheel. So on this engine, that is this cover right here. In some cases on these pit bike engines, this cover and this cover are all one piece, but this one, it's a separate piece. So I've got a bolt here, there's one there, and one there. I'm gonna have to remove all of those. And it's important to note that these bolts may be different sizes. So you can usually check when you put it back together to see which size fits where, but if you want, you can take a piece of cardboard and kind of draw this out and put each bolt where it goes, or you can remove the bolts and pull this cover off all as one piece and leave the bolts kind of intact there so you don't forget. Most of the time these are going to be an 8mm socket to remove them. Once all of those are completely free, you can see I'm trying to show you how to remove this with them in place so you don't have to even figure out where they go later. Just be careful not to drop any, and then you'll want to pull this side cover out and off. Now there is some magnetic force working against you here, so just kind of be careful. You don't want to pull too hard. There you go. I do want to note that on this style of engine, the bolt that's here and here for the cover are also going all the way through to the electric starter motor and holding that in place. As you can see, I've got those bolts removed and my starter motor hasn't fell out. I can remove it if I want to, but it should stay in place. You can see there's an O-ring on here, maybe you can see that, and it goes through the case and it kind of stays in place, but just be mindful of that. Looking at it from the front, there's the gear attached to the starter motor. This is the starter motor here, this circle, and you can see it can actually come out of there, but most of the time, if you're not leaning it up against the workbench like I am, it'll stay pretty well in place. But just, again, keep an eye on that while you work. Once that's off, you can see why this is the easier style to replace. Because when you pull this cover off, the stator is actually mounted right to the back side of that cover, and you don't have to mess with the flywheel at all in order to do a stator replacement. Now, in order to get the stator out of the cover, you've got two 8mm hex bolts here. There's another bolt here, also 8mm hex socket. And then you've got two Phillips or JIS bolts here. Anytime you have what looks like a Phillips head bolt on a Chinese product, be very careful with it. Make sure you find a screwdriver that matches up very well. So make sure you just put the screwdriver in there and see how much it wiggles. If it wiggles around much, find something different, because a lot of times these are pretty easy to strip. So I'll go ahead and start with a pickup. Another tip with these while I'm removing them is these tend to be M6 by 1.0 thread. That's what most of these will be. So if you have a problem with anything Phillips head or JIS, you can get usually cap screws, Allen head, or hex head, some people call them. Look at this thing. This thing is in there real nice. But you can replace those with a different kind of bolt if you got a problem. So I've got a problem right now. This does not want to come out. You can try an impact driver. Before I do that, I'm going to try something really simple. I'm going to put my screwdriver in there. I'll lay it down flat, and then I'm going to give my screwdriver a couple of taps with a hammer to set it. And then I'll try again and see if it'll be removed that time. There we go. If that doesn't work again, go and get an impact driver and give it another shot. With both of those out, now the pickup is able to be pulled from the cover. Go ahead and remove this bolt up here in the corner. Pull this bracket off, And basically that's just holding the wires in place there. So once that's off, there's a grommet up here. You can just kind of pull that out, and then the wires are free and the pickup is free, and now all I've got to do is remove those 2 bolts for the stator. And they put these things in there tight. For an M6, that is very, very tight. And again, you'll want to make sure you keep all your fasteners straight so you know what goes where. Alright, now I've got all the bolts out of there, wires are free, pickup's free, and you can see the stator comes right out. While the stator's out of there, if you've got nothing else attached to this, now would be a good time to clean this cover up nice. Get some soap and water or your favorite degreaser and go ahead and scrub that out. Let it thoroughly dry before you put the stator back in. In my case, I'm not going to worry about that. This thing is just going to go sit in a corner somewhere for who knows how many years. So I don't have a replacement stator. I'm just going to put the original back in. Same process either way, as long as your stator matches up, which is one other thing I wanted to say. When you shop for a stator for your Chinese product, whether it's a moped, a pit bike, a scooter, whatever it is, be very careful and look over the stators that are available to you, because there tend to be quite a few options. Check the wiring, the pinouts on the connectors, and make sure the connectors actually match. Look at how many poles you've got here on the stator, pickup style. Check everything out and just make sure it matches up. So anyway, obviously this matches up since I just took it off of here. So the first thing I'm going to do is slide that into place right over that kind of boss there, and line my 2 mounting holes for the stator up with the mounting holes in the case cover, and then I can put my stator mount bolts back in there. When you tighten these up, you just need to get them snug, or if you happen to have a torque spec, go ahead and use the torque specs for those. Now with that in place, the next thing I'm going to do is get my pickup back in. When you install the pickup, make sure the wire is following the proper routing. You can see there's kind of a channel here in the case. The wire should go down there and sit between the pickup, the back of the pickup there, and the engine case. So you just want to make sure that's out of the way and not going to be pinched by anything and not going to get hit by the rotating flywheel. Once you're sure that's correct, you can go ahead and reinstall your bolts or screws. Again, if you've got a torque spec, tighten these to your torque spec. Otherwise, just get them nice and snug. You don't want to install them like the bolts were from the factory with my engine. Now I'm going to grab this bundle of wires that comes from the stator. You should have a grommet on there, as well as a place in the case for that grommet to fit. So you can go ahead and slide that into place on the case, just like that. You'll want to make sure the wire is running right up here against the top of the case. Then you can take this bracket. You can see from the marks on this that it basically pushes down on that a bit, and it holds this up. That way this wire doesn't hang down and get hit by the spinning flywheel. Go ahead and put that into place and install the bolt for it. As always, if you got a torque spec, use it. That finishes up installing the stator into the cover. Now we just need to get the cover back on the engine. Before you do, it's not a bad idea just to double check. Make sure all these wires are indeed secure and aren't going to get hit by anything. Now I'm just going to flip the cover over. Make sure nothing's in the way back here. If you've got gaskets on your engine, check the conditions of the gaskets, replace if necessary. And then you can slide this cover back into place. You can see again, that magnetic force kind of pulls it on for you, so you don't even really have to hold it. And then you can begin reinstalling the bolts around here. I'm going to use this bolt hole here as an example of how you can tell if you've got the right bolt in the right hole. So we've got 3 different lengths of bolts here. We've got a couple of long ones and then one short one. So let's start with a short one. If you put a bolt into the hole and it goes all the way in and you don't see any threads or don't hit any threads, that bolt is too short. And we'll use the next size up. Put that in. That's looking pretty good. You've got a little bit of room to thread it in, but there's not a ton of the bolt hanging out. Last one. Now we've got a lot of bolt hanging out. If you've got more than an inch or so of bolt hanging out, that bolt is too long for that hole. So just by process of elimination, this one, the middle size bolt, would be the right one for this hole. And while I'm here, again, a reminder, your electric start is attached to these two bottom bolts, so make sure that stays in place when you're putting this cover back on and all the bolts back in. Now to complete the job, take the wires coming out of the cover, find the plug that you originally unplugged your stator from, and go ahead and plug your new stator in. If you still don't have spark after you replace the stator, it could be something else, but you might want to go ahead and take a look at the wires in the connector coming from your new stator and look at a wiring diagram if you can find one for whatever bike you have, and see if they seem to match up to the functions that they're supposed to. They may or may not actually match up to the colors. I can give you an example with this one of just some common colors. You never know when you're dealing with this Chinese stuff, but usually when you've got a green wire coming from the stator, that is going to be a ground wire. Yellow and white, generally solid yellow and white wires, are usually charging and lighting wires. A lot of times a black with a red stripe or red with a black stripe will be the exciter coil wire that powers up the CDI, and a blue with a white stripe or white with a blue stripe is usually the pickup wire. These are not always the case, but those are some pretty common uses of these wires. Alright, now let's move on to the second style of stator replacement. So this is again a Piranha 160cc engine. There's an awful lot of pit bike style engines that will be similar to this. So again, just like the other, you can see wires coming out from the stator area here. You need to follow that bundle of wires to their connectors and disconnect them. Now you'll need to remove the side cover from the engine. In the case of this model, this is all one piece, and there are bolts here, here, and here. In some cases you may need to remove the shifter. If you do, there's usually just one bolt. Remove that completely, and then the shifter will slide off of the spline shaft. This one has a gasket, so got to be careful not to damage the gasket when you remove the cover. I'm going to go ahead and take the gasket off just to keep it out of the way and make sure I don't damage it. Now you can see why this style is a little more difficult than the other. In the other one, the stator was located conveniently right under the cover, so you just pulled the cover off. In this case, the stator is hidden behind the flywheel, so the flywheel has to be removed. The first step for that is to remove this nut. In this case, I've got a 14mm nut here. You can use a pin style spanner like this, insert that into holes in the flywheel and hold it while you use a ratchet and remove the nut. What I prefer to do is to use an impact because it's much faster and easier for removal. This is where things can get strange sometimes when you watch other videos about removing a flywheel or replacing a stator on these engines. Because the flywheel is not something that just pulls right off. You're not going to be able to just grab it with your hand and pull it off. If you can, there's a problem with it, and you need to check the crank and the flywheel both. Because the way this works is there's a taper bored into the flywheel, and there's a taper cut into the crank, and those tapers interact with each other, and that holds the flywheel securely in place. There is a keyway cut into the flywheel and a woodruff key installed into the crankshaft to locate the flywheel, but that is basically just an easy way to get the flywheel installed properly. That's not actually what holds your flywheel in place. It's actually held by the taper of the crank and the flywheel interacting with each other. The proper way to remove a flywheel like this is to use a flywheel puller specifically for the threads of your flywheel. If you look closely at the intersection of the flywheel, you can see that there are threads cut into it, and that is specifically for the use of a flywheel puller. This engine uses M27 by 1.0 left-hand threads for the flywheel puller. So 27mm diameter, 1mm thread pitch, and left-hand thread. So instead of the normal righty-tighty, lefty-loosey, you actually turn left to tighten this one up, or counterclockwise. So that's the kind of flywheel puller that I have here. I'm going to go ahead and thread that in. Again, you'll see that To thread that in, I'm actually going to turn it the opposite way that you normally would because it's left-hand thread. And I got to back this section out so I can get it all the way in there. Then I can put a wrench on this one, hang on to the flywheel, and just tighten that a little bit more. Now I'm going to turn this piece in until it butts up against the crank. You'll know that when it just kind of stops. This particular flywheel puller uses a T-handle, which is a bit unusual. Most of them will have kind of a bolt just sticking out of here, so you put a wrench on the bolt and you tighten it, which by the way will be clockwise, just like normal. And you hold this section of the flywheel puller still while you tighten that, and that will pull the flywheel off. This one has a T-handle, so what you can do is hold that section of it and try to tighten the T-handle by hand, or what I normally do is just put a wrench on here like you see, and then I'll just give this a tap right here on this edge to work the direction that I would tighten it, and that quickly breaks it free. Once it's broken free, then you can pull the flywheel right off. Once that's off, then you can remove your flywheel puller. Since these are left-hand threads, you actually turn them clockwise to remove it, and then you're done with your flywheel puller. I'm just going to slide this back on here for demonstration purposes. I'm not actually going to install it. Just because I wanted to talk about something, you'll see a lot of people in other videos are trying to avoid buying a flywheel puller. And if you're in a pinch, I get it. Sometimes maybe you're broke down or something and you've got to get going, then maybe try some alternative methods. But in general, a flywheel puller is fairly inexpensive. I mean, sometimes you can get these things for less than $10. And overall, they make your life easier to own them. So one of the things you'll see is tapping on the side of a flywheel with a mallet or a hammer. I would suggest don't ever use a hammer, a steel hammer. Use a rubber mallet if you're going to try it, and make sure that you are tapping and not beating. So what they'll do is they'll tap on the sides of this while they try to pull it off. And sometimes that'll work and sometimes it won't. You don't want to beat it. Another thing you'll see some people doing is they'll have a pry bar or a crowbar even, and they'll be trying to pry against the back of the flywheel, against the cases, to get the flywheel to pull off. Sometimes combining a crowbar and beating on the sides of it. Again, if you can use light pressure and manage not to damage anything, okay. But really, I strongly suggest you pick up a flywheel puller. They're so nice to have around, and they're not a huge investment. This stator is a bit different than the other style that we looked at. Aside from not being attached to the case cover, it actually has a stator plate, and you remove that plate and you can remove the whole deal. Now you can get a replacement stator and pickup and remove those from that plate if you prefer, but most of the time you'll find that they are sold with the whole plate. So we've got to remove the plate, and that has two big bolts here, one here, both Phillips head. And again, just like the other one, you want to make sure you find something that's a good match. So these are going to require a large screwdriver, not your standard small Phillips head. And make sure that fits in there very well before you try to remove them. With these larger machine screws on Chinese machines especially, I don't even bother to try to remove them until I give them a couple of taps on the end with a rubber mallet. Then I'll apply pressure inward while turning them counterclockwise. And that doesn't feel too good, so I'm not even going to continue from there with a screwdriver. Sometimes these can be easy to strip, so if it feels iffy to you at all, it doesn't feel substantial enough that it's going to turn, you think maybe it's going to strip, then go ahead and stop and go and grab an impact driver. This is an impact driver or an impact screwdriver. So normally these have interchangeable bits. You can swap them out on the end. Again, just like anything else, you're going to want to make sure this is a good fit into the screw that you're trying to remove. And then what you do is you hit the end of this with a hammer, and when you hammer this, it will actually twist. So it's applying force inward and twisting to help get that out without stripping it. So you can see, first tap, it broke that loose, and now I can just turn this to loosen. Before I get that all the way loose, I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing to the lower bolt. My shifter's in the way a little bit for the lower bolt, so I'm just going to push it down. I don't need to totally remove it, just to make a little extra clearance so I can get a straight shot in there, and then give this a couple taps. There you go. Now I'll go ahead and remove these screws or bolts the rest of the way. Before you remove this, and actually before you remove the bolts, you should be aware that there may be oil behind this plate because you will actually be opening up the crankcase when you remove the stator plate. There's a seal on the edges of this that helps to keep the oil sealed in there. And generally there's not much oil back here unless you've got the engine overfilled, at least with any design that I've ever messed with of these engines. But there may be oil that runs out when you remove this. Some people will actually prefer to drain the oil from the engine before they do a stator replacement. So these things do need pretty regular oil changes. May not be a bad idea to do an oil change at the same time. Drain the oil during your oil change and then do your stator replacement and then continue with the rest of your oil change. But what I'm going to do is take a clean container and set this under here so that it will catch anything that should run out of there. Again, I assume that there's not going to be much. I'm going to grab the stator and kind of wiggle it and pull it outward. And at the same time, I need to remove this grommet here where the wires are going through the case. I've had a very small amount of oil try to come out of there. So what I'll do is just wipe this up with a paper towel, clean this up. It's also helpful at this point, before you do this, you may want to just tilt the bike instead of leaning this way toward this side of the engine, lean it the other way, so that the oil tends to shift to the other side of the motor, and that may be enough that you don't get any oil out of here. But again, I'm going to go ahead and just wipe over this area and make sure this area where the seal will be is nice and clean. Now, just like the last time, I don't actually have a replacement stator. I don't have any issues with this. This thing has never even ran. I'm going to be putting this back into place. But what I will show you is that you've got two seals on your stator plate. You've got a seal here that goes right around the crankshaft. Then you've got this O-ring seal around the edge that seals against the case there, as you can see, to keep oil from flowing out. Before I install seals like that, what I like to do for the seal here is to take a little bit of grease and put it on the inner lip there and smear that around. And then also for the outer O-ring seal, I just like to basically get a residue of grease wiped all the way around there. I'm not actually trying to cake grease on there. You should also see that you have O-rings to seal around the bolts here and here. You'll want to take a look at those and make sure they're not damaged. If they are, they're pretty simple to pop out of there. You want to use something that's not sharp and gently pop that out. Then when you install a new one, just like the others, I like to put a little bit of grease on them, just a residue basically. And then you should be able to just kind of push this into place, if I can get it aligned here. There we go. Just apply some pressure and make sure it's seated. I'm going to make sure my pickup is in the right direction while my bolt holes are aligned here. And I will just slide this over the crankshaft. And it should take a little tiny bit of force because of that O-ring to seal there, just to sort of pop it into place. And even once it's in place, you can look through those holes, make sure they're aligned, and give it a little adjustment if you need to. Then I'm going to take this grommet and go ahead and push that into place on the case there. And now I can reinstall my screws. Now I'm ready to reinstall the flywheel. So you need to take note of where this key is on the crankshaft and align that with the keyway that is cut into the flywheel and slide your flywheel on. You may have to rotate a little. You can give a little push, but you're not going to be able to get it all the way on. Because of that taper fit that I talked about earlier, you actually have to install the nut and use the torque from that, pushing it on there to get it properly locked into place on the crank. So I'll go ahead and spin the nut on here by hand first. Now, if you have a torque spec, again, you can use one of these pin style spanners or some other means of holding the flywheel. Some people like to use a strap wrench or something like that. But you can hold the flywheel in place and then use a torque wrench and set this to your desired torque value. What I tend to do with most of my small engines is use a torque limiting stick on my impact, again because it's very fast and convenient. This is a 30 foot-pound torque stick, and then all I've got to do is zip it on, hold this flywheel a little bit, and there we go. Now what I'm going to do, since I've got a gasket on this thing, is I'm going to put the gasket onto my outer cover so that it aligns with all of the bolt holes, and then I can put a bolt through one of the holes, at least one of the holes. That allows me to keep the gasket at least roughly in place while I slide the assembly onto the engine, the cover, and I will get one of those bolts started loosely by hand. Then I can go ahead and install the others while I make sure that the gasket is aligned. And that bolt is too long for that hole. It's the other one. Again, start that one loosely, and then make sure the other bolt goes through the gasket and into the case as well. Now I'll just tighten all these. As I've said a bunch of times in this video, if you got a torque spec, go ahead and use it. Otherwise, these bolts should just be pretty snug. Now the only thing that's left is to find the wires coming out of that and go ahead and reconnect them to the harness on your scooter or dirt bike or whatever you've got. That about wraps it up. So if you've enjoyed the video or found it helpful, please give it a like. Don't forget to subscribe for more and click the bell to receive notifications. And thank you for watching.